Dear friends, welcome to my channel. I am Alexander Muzienko. Today is Wednesday, March 26th, and as usual, I have a briefing for you with up-to-date information on events that I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. Well, the ceasefire in the Black Sea. At least these are the results of the preliminary agreement in Saudi Arabia. Let's analyze this now. The previous video on my channel was dedicated to what preceded and the information psychological operations of Russia. What was stated by the representative of the Defense Committee of the Federation Council of Russia, Qatar, about Ukraine allegedly disrupting agreements that are about to be reached. And there is an explanation, by the way, of what Ukraine might have disrupted. And what could they have been arguing about? I have some insights on this matter, and they specifically relate to the possibility that sanctions against Russia might actually be lifted. A certain part, not all, but a certain part which concerns the state bank and some other financial institutions. This, according to the Kremlin and the White House, because it is in the statement from the White House of the USA, is supposed to lead to Russia gaining better access to the agricultural product market and agricultural chemical fertilizers. Why do the United States need this when they themselves also produce fertilizers and are interested in increasing their own presence, and more remains a mystery to this day? Even if Donald Trump himself, the President of the United States, admitted that some members of his team might have been under Moscow's influence, under Putin's influence, during negotiations, because they want to quickly achieve a ceasefire, as this is what the Ukrainians want. Is Trump noted, then perhaps something becomes clear. Well, but here it is about the fact that Russia is indeed setting strict conditions that sanctions need to be lifted. And only then can the ceasefire be effective, meaning that Russia, as always, has its own interpretation. And for example, what it means is that if we look, well, for instance, in the White House statement, they note that measures also need to be developed aimed at implementing a ban on strikes against energy facilities in both countries. And in fact, the USA is helping Russia return to the global market for agricultural products and fertilizers. In addition, the American side confirms its support for Ukraine in the return of military prisoners, civilian hostages, and illegally taken children, and ensuring safe navigation should be implemented, as stated by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. In fact, as of today, meaning as of March 25th, the ceasefire in the Black Sea and in energy comes into effect. As the head of the Ukrainian state noted, we do not strike their energy, they do not strike ours. This is essentially the position. Now a direct quote from Volodymyr Zelensky. Today it sounds like this: each side does not use accordingly weapons against energy. Against what? Meanwhile, the Russians launched strikes last night when under such a massive attack on Kryvyi Rih, as well as Sumy region, and the day before other Ukrainian regions were affected, because many Shaheds flew over Ukraine's territory last night. Well, of course, the Kremlin will say that it wasn't about energy and they were targeting somewhere else entirely. And that's where the drawbacks lie. The commander-in-chief, the president of Ukraine, very aptly and correctly pointed this out when he said what we need. Namely, a complete, comprehensive and unconditional ceasefire in the sky, on water and on land. I emphasize the word unconditional, so there are no conditions, no demands from the Kremlin, none of their so-called desires. But indeed a demonstration that we are ready to cease fire, yet Russia is taking steps backward. Thus, what does Putin actually want to achieve? Putin, thus, wants to achieve the maximum delay. And I'll say this: fatigue, fatigue of President Trump and his team in that, so that they see that quickly achieving, let's say, peace in Ukraine is impossible because Russia is actually blocking it. But the Kremlin will say, well, look, we are sitting with you for 12 hours in negotiations in Riyadh. We genuinely strive for both a ceasefire and future peace. Just take all your measures and apply them to exert pressure against Ukraine. Do not provide intelligence information, do not supply equipment and weapons, etc. And that's it. Plus, the Kremlin is stalling for time. For what purpose? The situation, for example, is escalating in terms of gas, and Israel is about to launch a major ground military operation against Gaza, the aim of which is already not only and not just to defeat the terrorist group Hamas, but possibly also to fully occupy the Gaza Strip. Of course, this could lead to diverting the informational focus away from Ukraine. Adding to this, it could provoke another large-scale refugee flow, comparable to the time when Russia began bombing the Syrian opposition. This is also worth remembering. And of course, this could lead to protests in the US and the West as pro-Palestinian groups might emerge. And this, among other things, will divert the focus of the global media's informational attention from the Russian-Ukrainian war and also the Kremlin's strategic intent. Let's add to this the complicated situation the United States has with Iran. To put it mildly, as American media have shown the fact that Iran demonstrated one of the largest stockpiles of missiles, and possibly even with a nuclear warhead already. In other words, this is essentially Iran's response to those letters, and it can almost be called an ultimatum that was issued by the United States of America towards Iran. I want to remind you that there was such an address the day before. It was rejected by Ayatollah Khamenei, and after that, missiles were demonstrated. Well, and then the Iranian foreign minister stated that Iran is preparing a response. We just see that this response is being significantly delayed. And accordingly, they are demonstrating missiles, which means the escalation here might not just be limited to strikes against Yemeni Houthis. And here there could be a much more serious situation that could lead to the outbreak of a larger scale war and confrontation in the Middle East. And the Russians are monitoring this. They are studying and understanding it. And obviously, they are hoping that this might happen. In order to truly divert attention from Ukraine, this is the Russian calculation. As for the ceasefire at sea, as the president of Ukraine rightly noted, it couldn't be said better. Moscow always lies. And in fact, he said that he did not agree with the condition that the prerequisite for a ceasefire in the Black Sea is the lifting of sanctions from the Kremlin. Zelensky noted the following: there are absolutely clear statements published by the White House. Everyone can see what is stated there. And there is what is being lied about again. The Kremlin, allegedly, the silence in the Black Sea depends on sanctions. Allegedly, the date for the start of silence regarding energy is March 18th. Moscow always lies, and it depends on the world and on everyone who truly needs peace, whether they will allow Russia to lie again. This is what the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, stated. And it is clear that the only criterion here will be time. The president of Ukraine also noted this. And indeed, Russia also did not relax, by the way. There is an understanding, and this is already in the statement, including from the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, that Ukraine will perceive the movement of the Russian Black Sea Fleet from the eastern part of the Black Sea towards the western part as a violation of the spirit of the agreements. Essentially, regarding the ceasefire. That is, it will be perceived this way, and accordingly, if you consider this statement, it can be understood and interpreted as Ukraine having the full right to respond to such aggressive actions by Russia. Well, and how to respond? Here you go. Regarding the Magura and the Malyuk, the surface drones that have effectively forced Russia to retreat its Black Sea Fleet to the eastern part, to the occupied up to unrecognized Abkhazia, and to destroy, sink, and damage a significant number of Russian military vessels. So the Ministry of Digital Transformation has presented another drone It is called Katra, capable of destroying targets at sea, on land, and in the air. The drone is of Ukrainian design, equipped with torpedoes, a minigun, a machine gun, man-pads, and other weapons, covering distances of over 1,000 kilometers. It performs strike and reconnaissance operations. Katra does not require a separate electronic warfare system due to its built-in system for automatic threat recognition and decoy deployment. Currently, information about missions with this drone is classified. However, we have another success from Ukrainian developers, which we congratulate and wish for successful applications. I think, friends, you will also join in these congratulations and wishes directly in the comments. It is very important to support our defense forces, and what is also interesting, noted the President of Ukraine. Yes, it is what Volodymyr Zelensky pointed out, that things at the front are going quite well for us now. This is also a hint that we should not relax, as our warriors, our defenders, are heroically working to ensure a truly strong position for Ukrainian negotiators. That is, this is what truly supports our diplomacy, provides opportunities to work, and ultimately gives us the chance to have more arguments in order to ensure that that was really our position. Strength. And it can also be said that ultimately our forces are operating along the entire front line. Currently, strikes are being carried out against the enemy in the Belgorod and Kursk regions as well as in Donetsk. Their offensive actions are being restrained. They are not allowed to launch a significant large-scale offensive in the Zaporizhia direction, thanks to the Ukrainian Defense Forces. It is important to understand this, and it reinforces our position. But of course, on this path, it is very important for Ukraine to have support, and to have support from partners in the timely, comprehensive, and complete supply of weapons, forces, equipment, armored vehicles, and ammunition for Ukraine. And in this regard, we have some not very encouraging news because, for example, Australia is delaying the delivery of previously promised tanks, Abrams, to Ukraine. The reason, as our Australian partner state, is disruptions possible in the operation of the logistics terminal in Rzeszów, Poland, which were related to the earlier suspension of military aid to Ukraine by the USA and its consequences. We see that this also affects Australia. Well, I hope the Australians are resolving this issue now to start the shipments as soon as possible. These tanks, but in the meantime, Ukraine is still achieving success in the air, and we are waiting for tanks to support on the ground. Although perhaps the role of the tank will be somewhat rethought after this war, and obviously tanks will not be abandoned, but they will be improved. Technically, they will be re-equipped with the aim of being better protected from drone attacks and having countermeasures, such as improved electronic warfare systems. And so on. This is quite possibly what might happen. Well, in the meantime, Ukraine is making significant progress in the use of drones. For example, British intelligence considers the attack on the Russian airbase Engels 2 on the night of March 20th the most successful operation of the Ukrainian Defense Forces in 2025. I think one of the biggest, because there will be more successful operations. It is almost certain that a number of aviation munitions which were used against Ukraine were stored in the area that was hit, British intelligence notes. They suggest that significant losses will likely disrupt the conduct of strike operations and the use of strategic Russian aviation for missile strikes on Ukrainian territory. And this is indeed a very serious success because we see that Russian strategic aviation, after March 20, strikes were carried out on Engels, and as of now they are not taking off, meaning at least large-scale strikes on Ukraine have been destroyed and postponed. This is very important. Well, in fact, we see that the Kremlin can conduct hybrid terrorist sabotage operations in Europe. For example, in the Czech Republic, there was an explosion at an ammunition depot. This happened on the morning of March 25th, when a fire broke out at the Czech ammunition depot. In fact, these could be actions, we understand, of the Kremlin. I want to remind you that back in May 2024, a number of representatives and heads, leaders of intelligence services from Britain, Germany, and the United States also warned that in 2024 and the beginning of 2025, the Kremlin might be preparing similar actions. I want to remind you that drones were recorded over training grounds where Ukrainian military personnel were being trained. Citizens, including Russians, were detained in Bavaria, who were studying the locations of German military-industrial complex facilities. And not only that, so Russia could indeed be involved. I hope that this will be another step for Europeans to strengthen and enhance their security and defense, and to produce more weapons in support of Ukraine. And perhaps precisely the issue of European security, its reinforcement, and precisely the counteraction to Russian threats will be raised and discussed at the European Security Summit, which will be preceded by a meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron. Because there is much to discuss. It seems to me that Europeans should already move to more active actions faster and more decisively, because there are too many discussions now, meetings are ongoing, which is all well and good, of various expert nature at the level of chiefs of staff, but real and effective actions are needed for the Kremlin to see them. The Kremlin is already wary, and it is declaring the militarization of Europe, the preparation for war. These are short signs, but still insufficient, meaning more preparation is needed. Faster and more seriously, because the challenges and threats are, of course, present for Europe. It is necessary to become stronger, to understand that, to avoid acknowledging the fact that we need to unite around Ukraine, that right now the European leader is Ukraine, indeed Ukraine, and we must recognize this and not be afraid to talk about it. We must clearly state this. This is very important for us, and Ukraine is altering various geopolitical scenarios and will continue to do so. Even the president of the USA, Donald Trump, is now stating that Russia is delaying the ceasefire. You see, there is already an understanding, well, we are waiting for appropriate counteractions. And Europe must realize that the war in Europe is already ongoing. This is Russian aggression against Ukraine. This is the largest war since World War II. And that Ukraine must be clearly integrated into a single large European security space. And then the issue should not just be about strengthening the border with Belarus or with Russia. It should be strengthened with Russia, but at Ukraine's border with Russia, and therefore all possible forces and means need to be provided now for effective counteraction. Deterring Russian aggression here in Ukraine, because, as noted by the deputy head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense, Vadim Skibitsky, the Russians have forecasted 15 possible scenarios of military conflicts up to the year 2045, 6 of which are related to Northern Europe. I want to note that practically none of the mentioned scenarios foresee that there will be no war at all in Europe. From Northern Europe, they only predict the time frame, the forces and means involved, and the corresponding possible consequences. And accordingly, of course, the strategies and plans based on whether this can happen in the short term or in the long term. I would also like to remind you that the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, back in January, speaking at the Munich Security Conference, talked about the threats to the Baltic countries and Poland from Russia, because they plan to conduct joint exercises Zapad 2025 with the Belarusians this year on the territory of Belarus. Therefore, there is something to think about. Meanwhile, a certain scandal was somewhat subdued in the United States of America due to this messenger signal where a journalist, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, ended up, but in whom principle the US president remains. Donald Trump keeps his national security advisor Little Waltz in position. But still, as they say, the residue remained, because American publications wrote a lot about it. And they wrote that Trump was actually angry with the advisors. But now, Trump is saving members of his team, taking the hit himself. Although it should be understood that this situation is unlikely to be left as it is. And perhaps the Democrats in Congress will demand certain investigations or hearings on this matter. And undoubtedly, they will use these arguments in the future as countermeasures against Donald Trump. Because the US president himself repeatedly accused his opponent during the previous 2016 election campaign. Hillary Clinton is accused of using a personal email for official correspondence, and the CIA director noted that signals can be used in messengers, and it seems there are no violations here either. But we understand that senators and congressmen might view this somewhat differently, so we will see how this situation develops in the future. Well, friends, please write what you think. Be sure to leave a comment. What do you think? Will Russia adhere to the ceasefire? Will the US position change towards putting more pressure on Putin, or will Trump change his viewpoint? This is very important, and continue to support Ukraine's defense forces. Together, we can do everything and overcome everything. With confidence and with God's help, we look ahead. We only move forward. Glory to Ukraine.